Washington, D.C., April 1st, 2026. Not a Tuesday you'll read about in the newspapers, not a date that made the evening news. The financial press moved on within hours. But buried inside a dry government document released that morning by the International Monetary Fund, there were 5 sentences, so precise, so alarming, and so deliberately obscured by technical language that if they had been printed on the front page of every newspaper on Earth, what happened next in global markets would have looked very different. The document was called the 2026 Articles IV Consultation for the United States. Most people have never heard of an Article IV consultation. That is by design. It is the IMF's private audit of a country's economy. A team of fund economists visits, studies the books, meets with Treasury officials, and then writes a report. Not for you, for the government, for policymakers. For the people in the room who are supposed to do something before it becomes a problem the rest of us cannot ignore. What the April 1st report said about America, about global debt, about the fiscal condition of the countries you live in and pay taxes to, was the kind of thing that no elected official will repeat at a press conference. And the reason they won't is exactly why you need to hear it. Most people think the IMF is a rescue organization. They think it shows up after the crisis, writes a check, attaches some conditions, and flies home. That is the version of the IMF you were shown in the headlines. Argentina 2001, Greece 2015, Pakistan 2023. The IMF is emergency room. But the other half of what the IMF does, the half that almost nobody talks about, is surveillance. Continuous, forensic, bilateral surveillance of every economy on the planet. Every year, teams of economists sit across the table from finance ministers and central bank governors and tell them, in the most precise technical language available, exactly what is wrong and exactly what will happen if it is not fixed. Those conversations happen behind closed doors. The reports are published in dense bureaucratic language that most journalists never read and most citizens never encounter. This is not an accident. It is a filtering mechanism. The information exists. It is public. But it is wrapped in so many layers of technical vocabulary, so many footnotes and reference tables, that it functions in practice as a secret hiding in plain sight. And right now, in April 2026, the IMF's plain sight secrets are the most important data in the global economy. What they are telling governments in private consultation documents, in fiscal monitors, in Article IV reports, is not a nuanced economic debate. It is a set of specific, documented, time-stamped warnings about a trajectory that the historical record says ends in one way and one way only. Let's go through exactly what those warnings are, one by one, with the precision the IMF itself uses. Because precision is the only thing that cuts through the noise. The first thing the IMF told governments in its April 2026 consultation with the United States is that American general government debt has already reached 123.9% of GDP, not approaching, not projected to reach, already there. As of the consultation completed April 1st, 2026, one of the world's most important economic institutions sat across from the world's largest economy and put those numbers on the table. And then it said something more specific and more alarming than the number itself. It warned that the current fiscal trajectory creates what it called a growing financial stability tail risk, not just for the United States, but for the global economy as a whole. Read that again slowly. A tail risk is the kind of event that destroys the normal distribution. It is the event in the far right of the probability curve that conventional models say is rare, but that history says is not. When the IMF uses that phrase in a formal document about the United States, it is not making an abstract academic point. It is describing the structural condition of the system that every other country's economy is wired through. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. American Treasury bonds are the benchmark against which every other sovereign bond on earth is priced. When the institution that exists to maintain global financial stability says that the largest economy in the world poses a growing tail risk to that stability, that is not a footnote. That is the headline. The numbers behind that warning are worth examining closely. The IMF does not project American debt at 123.9% of GDP and stop there. Its own medium-term projections show that number blowing past 141.5% by 2031. That is 5 years from where we are standing right now, without a recession, without a war, without a new pandemic, just the current trajectory, compounding forward. And here's the piece that makes it worse. The IMF's April 2026 Executive Board did not merely observe this trajectory. It explicitly called for what it described as a front-loaded fiscal adjustment, emphasizing the word pressing. Pressing. Not gradual, not preferred. Pressing. That is institutional language for now, before the window closes. The question worth sitting with is this. If the window is still open, why isn't any government walking through it? The answer to that question is the second thing the IMF is telling governments that they won't tell you. Let's go to Brussels, December 2025. The IMF completed what it calls a staff concluding statement for Belgium, a country most people consider well-managed, prosperous, stable. What the IMF told Belgian policymakers in documented detail was that ongoing pension reform is a critical step, and that even with planned reforms, Belgian pension spending is still projected to reach 12.2% of GDP by 2070. And it told them further cuts are needed. Not suggested, needed. It recommended eliminating tax expenditures worth over 6% of GDP. It called for healthcare efficiency measures and substantial spending reviews. This is not the Belgium you see in the tourism brochures. This is the Belgium inside the fiscal audit. And Belgium is not an outlier. In February 2026, the IMF completed its Article IV consultation with Germany, one of the most fiscally conservative large economies on earth, the country that invented the term debt brake and built it into its constitution. What did the IMF recommend for Germany? Pension reforms to encourage longer working lives, cuts in what it called environmentally harmful subsidies, sectoral spending reviews to identify savings. The IMF looked at Germany, a country that is currently spending massively on defense and managing an aging workforce, and told them privately that the math ahead is severe. This is not about bad governments or irresponsible governments. Germany is not Argentina. Belgium is not Zimbabwe. The pattern that is emerging from the IMF's 2025 and 2026 Article IV consultations is not a story about mismanagement. It is a story about arithmetic. The arithmetic of an aging world, where the promises made to retirees were calculated on demographic assumptions that no longer hold. The arithmetic of a high interest rate environment where the cost of carrying debt has risen dramatically and is not going back down to the conditions that made debt tolerable for the previous decade. And the arithmetic of a world where the fiscal space that governments would need to respond to the next shock simply does not exist. The IMF's fiscal monitor from October 2025 put the global number on the table with clarity. Global public debt exceeded $100 trillion in 2024. By 2029, the IMF projects that global public debt will surpass 100% of world GDP, a level not seen since 1948, the year the world was rebuilding from the most destructive war in human history. We are approaching the debt burden of a world that had just finished World War II, not because we fought a war of that magnitude, but because we have been borrowing against the future at the rate of people who believe the future will always be cheaper than the present. And here's the dimension that makes this specific moment different from every other point in the debt accumulation cycle since 2008. For the decade between the global financial crisis and the pandemic, debt was rising, but interest rates were falling. The world was borrowing more, but the cost of borrowing was declining. The interest bill on the world's total public debt was, counterintuitively, stable or even shrinking relative to GDP. That created a dangerous illusion, the illusion that debt itself had become costless, that you could accumulate it indefinitely because the carrying cost kept dropping. The IMF's October 2025 fiscal monitor is extraordinarily direct about what ended that illusion. It says the situation is now starkly different. Interest rates have increased considerably in global markets, and their path forward is highly uncertain. That is the central fact of 2025 and 2026 that almost every government is choosing not to communicate clearly to its citizens. The cost of carrying the debt has gone up, the income to cover it has not kept pace. And the political options for closing the gap are all painful enough that no one wants to go first. This brings us to the third thing the IMF is telling governments right now that they will not tell you. The IMF's own chief economist, Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas, stood at a press briefing in April 2025 and said words that deserve to be read out loud. He said, "We are entering a new era. The global economic system that has operated for the last 80 years is being reset." He was talking about tariffs and trade. But the statement was larger than tariffs, because the system he was describing, the one being reset, is not just the trade architecture. It is the entire post-war arrangement in which American economic dominance provided the world with a stable reserve currency, an open trading system, and a set of institutional guardrails that kept financial crises localized rather than global. That arrangement is unwinding, not overnight, not in a single dramatic event. But the IMF's own chief economist used the word reset. And the April 2026 Article IV for the US warned explicitly of the risk of an eventual disorderly external rebalancing. Disorderly external rebalancing is the technical term for what happens when the world stops financing American deficits on the terms America has enjoyed, when the dollar stops being treated as the automatic safe harbor for global savings, when the rest of the world decides, at whatever pace and through whatever mechanism, that the American fiscal trajectory is no longer a credible guarantee. The IMF does not predict this. It documents the conditions that make it increasingly probable. That is a meaningful distinction. It is the difference between a doctor who says you will have a heart attack and a doctor who says your arteries show progressive blockage, and your current lifestyle is not compatible with long-term cardiac health. Both are serious. Only one is a prediction. The IMF is the second doctor. And the cardiovascular report it is releasing right now to governments across the world is not optimistic. Here's what the IMF said about 55 countries in its October 2025 fiscal monitor. 55 nations on Earth are currently assessed at high or distressed levels of fiscal risk. These are not the countries of the global periphery alone. Many of them are countries with governments, roads, hospitals, universities, pension systems, and populations who believe with complete sincerity that they live in stable, functional states. The risk assessment does not say those governments are corrupt or incompetent. It says the math does not work. And the math not working is a statement about trajectory, not intention. The mechanism through which fiscal risk becomes fiscal crisis follows a specific sequence that the IMF's own forensic database has documented across decades and across continents. First, debt rises relative to GDP. Then, interest payments begin to crowd out other spending. Then, the government faces a choice between servicing the debt and paying for the services its population depends on. Then it borrows more to cover both. Then the markets notice the debt-to-GDP ratio accelerating and demand higher interest rates to compensate for the risk. Then, the higher interest rates make the debt even more expensive to carry. Then, the primary surplus required to stabilize debt becomes politically impossible to achieve. And then you are in what economists call a debt spiral, not a theoretical debt spiral. A documented, historically observable, mathematically predictable debt spiral. The IMF's own publication called Finance and Development, released in March 2026, identified the countries that currently need fiscal adjustment of more than 5% of GDP relative to their 2024 baselines. There are 5 of them: France, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and the United States. The world's largest economy is on the same list as 3 countries in Central and Eastern Europe that are managing genuinely fragile fiscal positions. That is not a reassuring piece of company. And the same publication notes, with characteristic understatement, that the countries with the biggest adjustment needs are unlikely to deliver the measures needed to stabilize their debt levels. Read that sentence again. The IMF is not saying there is uncertainty about whether these countries will adjust. It is saying its own analysis suggests they probably will not. In an institution that has spent its entire existence encouraging countries to believe adjustment is possible, that language is extraordinary. Now here is where the historical forensics become essential. Because what the IMF is describing in its April 2026 documents is not an unprecedented situation. It is a precisely documented pattern that has occurred before. Every time it has occurred before, it resolved the same way. Not through voluntary fiscal adjustment, not through a painless tightening of belts. It resolved through one of 3 mechanisms, often in combination. Default, which restructures the debt by forcing creditors to accept less than they were promised. Inflation, which restructures the debt by eroding its real value so that it is repaid in money worth less than the money borrowed. Or direct fiscal seizure, meaning austerity, pension cuts, tax increases, and the confiscation in various forms of the wealth that citizens believed was theirs. These are not warnings about distant theoretical possibilities. They are the documented outcomes of every prior iteration of the conditions the IMF is currently describing. And the IMF knows this. Its staff has read the autopsy reports. Its economists wrote many of them. What they are telling governments in the Article IV Consultations and the fiscal monitors and the World Economic Outlook reports is not a novel analysis. It is a pattern recognition. The pattern has been seen before. The sequence is known, the endpoint is documented, and the time required to avoid the endpoint is shrinking. Let's be specific about what governments are actually being told to do, because this is the part that is almost entirely absent from public discourse. The Article IV Consultation documents are public. Anyone can read them. But almost nobody does, because they are long and dense and written for finance ministers, not for citizens. What they contain consistently across consultation after consultation in 2025 and 2026 is a list of prescriptions. The prescriptions are not comfortable. They are not politically viable in any democracy where elections occur more frequently than fiscal crises. And that gap between what the IMF recommends and what governments are willing to tell their populations is where the risk lives. Germany was told to reform its pension system and encourage longer working lives. Belgium was told to raise penalties for early retirement and cut tax expenditures worth tens of billions annually. The United Kingdom's consultation in 2025 warned of limited fiscal space and emphasized the importance of staying the course on deficit reduction, noting that additional measures may be required if risks materialize. Nicaragua was told to reform its pension system and enhance tax collection. The United States was told on April 1st of this year that its fiscal imbalances are long-standing and need pressing front-loaded adjustment. Country after country, in the dry and polished language of international institutional finance, is being told the same essential message. You have made promises you cannot keep with the resources you currently have, and the cost of not addressing this is escalating with every quarter you delay. But here's the fourth thing the IMF is telling governments that they will not tell you. It is not just about debt. It is about what happens when the debt problem intersects with the other structural fracture that the April 2026 World Economic Outlook addresses under the title Getting to Growth in an Age of Uncertainty. The IMF's April 2026 report on defense spending is one of the most quietly alarming documents produced by any international institution in recent memory. It found that large defense spending booms have become more frequent, especially in emerging market and developing economies. And it found that ramping up defense spending can raise medium-term growth, but also weakens fiscal and external sustainability and risks crowding out social spending. Read the second half of that sentence, crowding out social spending. This is the institutional language for the trade-off that is coming for dozens of countries simultaneously. Geopolitical tension is real. The pressures driving increased military spending are real. No government that is watching what happened in Ukraine, what is happening across the Taiwan Strait, what is happening in the Middle East, has the luxury of ignoring defense. But every dollar spent on defense in a country with an already stretched fiscal position is a dollar that cannot be spent on healthcare, on pensions, on infrastructure, on the social contracts that hold modern democracies together. The IMF's April 2026 World Economic Outlook does not resolve this tension. It documents it. It places the fiscal cost of the geopolitical moment on top of the already existing fiscal cost of aging populations, high debt service, and the lingering legacy of pandemic-era borrowing. And it notes, with mathematical precision, that the resulting picture is not sustainable under current trajectories. The global growth number from the IMF's January 2026 World Economic Outlook update is worth sitting with. Global growth is projected at 3.3% for 2026 and 3.2% for 2027. These are not catastrophic numbers in isolation, but they are numbers for a world carrying over $100 trillion in public debt, with 55 countries at high or distressed fiscal risk, with the world's largest economy running a deficit of nearly 6% of GDP, with interest payments on American debt alone having crossed $1 trillion annually for the first time in history. When you layer the debt trajectory on top of the growth trajectory, the gap between the two becomes the story. Debt is growing faster than the economy. It has been growing faster than the economy consistently since the pandemic, and the IMF's own documents acknowledge that without major fiscal adjustments, the trajectory does not improve. The fifth thing the IMF is telling governments that they will not tell you is this: the tariff shock that began in April 2025 is not over. Its effects are still compressing global trade, still elevating uncertainty, still discouraging the investment that would be needed to grow out of the debt problem rather than adjust painfully through it. The IMF's October 2025 World Economic Outlook revised global growth upward from the April panic lows, but noted that projections remain below pre-policy shift forecasts. That phrase, pre-policy shift, is doing enormous work. It is saying that the world's growth potential has been permanently reduced from where it was before the tariff architecture of 2025 was constructed. That lost growth potential is not a temporary wound. It is a permanent reduction in the denominator against which debt to GDP ratios are calculated. A slower growing world with the same amount of debt is a more indebted world, not because anyone borrowed more, but because the base shrank. JP Morgan placed the probability of an American recession in 2025 at 60%. The IMF itself raised its recession probability for the United States from 25% to 37% in its April 2025 assessment. Even by the more conservative IMF estimate, there is now a greater than 1 in 3 chance of the world's largest economy contracting in a year when its debt is already at 124% of GDP and its deficit is nearly 6% of output. What a recession does to that arithmetic is not complicated. Revenue falls, spending rises automatically as unemployment benefits and stabilizer programs kick in, the deficit widens, the debt grows faster. The interest rate required to attract buyers of that debt rises as the fiscal trajectory deteriorates, and the already limited fiscal space for response contracts further. This is not speculation. This is the sequence the IMF has documented in every prior iteration of high debt plus recession it has analyzed. What is different about 2026 is that the starting position is more stretched than at almost any previous point in peacetime history. So what does the IMF actually want governments to do? The prescriptions are consistent across all the consultation documents. Reduce primary deficits through a combination of spending restraint and revenue measures. Reform pension systems to extend working lives and reduce benefit generosity. Cut subsidies, particularly energy subsidies, that are inefficient and regressive. Broaden the tax base and improve collection rather than raising headline rates that trigger evasion. And do all of this while protecting targeted spending on the most vulnerable populations, who are typically the people who bear the largest absolute cost of fiscal crisis when it eventually arrives. These are not unreasonable prescriptions in economic terms. They are the same prescriptions that worked in Portugal and Ireland and Spain after 2010, countries that were forced by market discipline into adjustments so painful that their populations are still living with the consequences. The IMF's own March 2026 Finance and Development publication documents how those countries, after years of agonizing adjustment, achieved growth rates that outpaced the United States. The lesson? Fiscal discipline and structural reforms pay off, eventually, after considerable pain, for populations that had no choice. The IMF's concern in April 2026 is precisely that most of the countries that need adjustment still have a choice. They have not yet been forced by market discipline into the room where the painful decisions are made. They still have what economists call fiscal space, though considerably less than they did a decade ago. They can still borrow at rates that do not yet reflect the full deterioration of their fiscal trajectories. And as long as they can, the political incentive to avoid adjustment remains overwhelming, because adjustment means telling voters that the promises were too generous, that the math does not work, that the future will require more than the present was paid for. No government has ever won an election on that message. What the historical record shows, and what the IMF's own surveillance data confirms with uncomfortable consistency, is that voluntary adjustment, the kind that happens before markets force it, is extraordinarily rare. Greece did not adjust voluntarily. Argentina did not adjust voluntarily. Venezuela did not adjust voluntarily. Lebanon did not adjust voluntarily. They were all told, in language almost identical to what the IMF is currently deploying in its Article IV consultations, that the trajectory was unsustainable. They all continued on that trajectory until the market stopped financing it. And then the adjustment happened anyway, but in the worst possible way. Sudden, disorderly, disproportionately borne by the people who had the least and who had trusted the most. The question this moment demands is not whether the IMF's warnings are accurate. The documentation is too precise, the pattern too consistent, the historical precedent too clear for that debate to be serious. The question is what a person who has read those warnings does with the knowledge that the governments they pay taxes to, the institutions they save into, the currencies they hold their futures in, are all receiving the same set of formal advisories and publishing them in documents too dense for anyone to read, while their press releases emphasize the parts that are least alarming, and their politicians continue discussing fiscal policy in the language of permanent prosperity. The IMF's chief economist stood at a press conference in the spring of 2025 and said, "We are entering a new era. The global economic system that has operated for the last 80 years is being reset." He was not making a political speech. He was not trying to frighten anyone. He was describing in the most concise language available to him in a public setting the conclusion that the institution's own forensic analysis of the global fiscal condition had produced. And then the press moved on to the next story, and the governments returned to their budget meetings, and the citizens went back to lives organized entirely around the assumption that the system their government manages is stable, solvent, and structurally sound. The April 2026 IMF Executive Board document on the United States does not use the word crisis. It uses the words growing financial stability tail risk. The October 2025 Fiscal Monitor does not say collapse is coming. It says global public debt risks are widespread and tilted towards debt accumulating even faster, and that policymakers must act now. The March 2026 Finance and Development article does not predict default. It says countries with the biggest adjustment needs are unlikely to deliver the measures needed to stabilize their debt levels. This is how the IMF communicates, not with alarm, with precision. The precision is the alarm. And the gap between what that precision describes and what governments are willing to communicate to the people they govern is the most important information gap in the global economy right now. Every major financial collapse in documented history was preceded by a period in which the institutions that were supposed to prevent it had already identified the problem, had already documented the trajectory, had already issued the warnings. The warnings existed before Greece froze bank withdrawals. They existed before Argentina froze accounts in December 2001. They existed before Lebanon's banking system effectively confiscated the savings of its middle class. They existed before every iteration of the pattern in every language, across every continent. They were there. They just were not in the place where ordinary people look for news about their financial lives. They were in the documents, precisely worded, technically dense, publicly available, and functionally invisible. The April 2026 World Economic Outlook, the April 1st, 2026 Article IV Consultation for the United States, the October 2025 Fiscal Monitor, the March 2026 Finance and Development Analysis of Debt Sustainability in Advanced Economies. These documents exist. Every number in this analysis came directly from them. They are not hidden. They are not classified. They are sitting on the IMF's website in PDF format, available to anyone who knows to look and has the patience to read them. Most people don't know to look, and that is the precise function of the layer of technical language they are wrapped in. You do not need to be an economist to understand the sequence the IMF is describing. You just need to understand that when the institution responsible for maintaining global financial stability says that the world's largest economy poses a growing tail risk to that stability, it is not using hyperbole. It is filing a formal report. When it says 55 countries are at high or distressed levels of fiscal risk, it is not predicting catastrophe for all of them. It is documenting the conditions under which catastrophe becomes increasingly likely if the required adjustments do not happen. When it says countries with the biggest adjustment needs are unlikely to deliver, it is not making a cynical political comment. It is extrapolating from the historical record of how governments behave when adjustment is voluntary versus mandatory. The IMF performs economic surveillance so that governments have the information they need to act before markets force the issue. The governments receive that information. The governments do not pass it on. And the people whose savings and pensions and retirement systems are exposed to the fiscal trajectories those documents describe continue building their financial lives on the assumption that the institutions managing those trajectories are operating within sustainable parameters. They are not. The documents say so. In April 2026, right now, in plain sight. This channel exists to read the documents that most people never see, to translate the technical language into the historical pattern it describes, and to give you the information your government received and chose not to pass on. Because the distance between what the IMF is telling governments right now and what those governments are telling their citizens is not a gap in communication. It is a structural feature of the system, and it has always been at its widest in the period just before the adjustment happens the hard way. The pattern is not hidden. It is just written in a language that assumes you won't read it. Subscribe, because the next document has already been filed. And the next warning is already in the room where the decisions are being made that will eventually, in one form or another, become the news that affects everything you have.